The standard explanation is straightforward. Cities in the 19th century were growing fast. Infrastructure was needed. And so, cities built hospitals. That's the accepted account. It's reasonable. It's logical. And for most cases, it holds. But then you look at the numbers. Between 1840 and 1880, dozens of cities across North America and Western Europe erected hospital complexes of extraordinary scale, facilities designed to house hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 patients simultaneously. These were not modest clinics assembled from local materials. They were stone-built, multi-wing, architecturally sophisticated institutions with subterranean pipe systems, ventilated ward designs, and integrated water distribution built directly into the walls. The populations these hospitals were built to serve, at the time of construction, could not have filled them. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Consider what a hospital, at scale, actually requires. It requires a population dense enough to generate sufficient illness. It requires a trained medical workforce capable of operating the facility. It requires supply chains for medicines, instruments, linens, and food. And it requires an administrative system sophisticated enough to coordinate all of the above continuously. These conditions develop slowly. They accumulate over decades. Medical schools take generations to produce physicians in meaningful numbers. Drug supply infrastructure develops in response to demand. Laundry systems, dietary kitchens, morgues, each element reflects years of accumulated institutional knowledge about what hospitals need to function. And yet, in city after city, the buildings arrived before the conditions that would justify them. In 1855, the population of a mid-sized American city might sit at 40,000 people. Its hospital, constructed that same decade, held 800 beds. At standard historical illness rates, you would need a population roughly 5 to 6 times that size before such a facility could operate at meaningful capacity. The building wasn't catching up to the population. The building was waiting for it. That gap, between what was built and what existed to use it, has a conventional explanation. Planners were forward-thinking. They anticipated growth. They built for the future. This is plausible. Urban planners have always tried to project forward. And some of the mid-century building programs were indeed tied to explicit growth projections. But projection-based building tends to be modular. You build what you need now, and you design for expansion later. What doesn't typically happen is this. You build a full-capacity, fully equipped, architecturally complete institution for a population that won't arrive for another 30 to 50 years. And the question becomes more pointed when you examine not just the size of these buildings, but their internal systems. The ventilation architecture in several institutions built in the 1850s and 1860s reflected principles that weren't formally documented in medical literature until the 1870s and 1880s. Cross-ventilation ward design, the idea that air should flow continuously through patient areas to reduce infection, was articulated most influentially by Florence Nightingale in 1863, following her observations during the Crimean War. Some of the hospitals already had it built in before she wrote a word. This is not a small detail. Ventilation in hospital wards is not decorative. It is not incidental to the building's function. It is a direct expression of a specific medical theory, the theory that airborne transmission plays a role in disease spread. Getting that detail right, in stone and mortar, before the theory was mainstream, before the evidence had accumulated, before the professional consensus had formed, that requires either remarkable foresight or access to knowledge that isn't clearly traceable in the conventional record. Some historians have noted this anomaly and attributed it to individual genius, an architect, a physician, a city planner who happened to be ahead of their time. That explanation is available. It is not obviously wrong. But it tends to be applied repeatedly. Building after building, city after city, the explanation of individual genius keeps appearing to account for systems that seem to have arrived fully formed. At a certain point, the frequency of the anomaly becomes part of the anomaly. There are also questions about materials. The hospitals built in this period were not constructed the way ordinary civic buildings were constructed. The brick and stone work in many of these institutions reflects an investment of resources, in quantity, in quality, in skilled labor, that does not match the economic profiles of the cities where they appeared. A city of 40,000, in 1855, had a limited tax base. It had limited access to quarried stone. It had limited pools of skilled masons and iron workers. And yet the hospitals it produced were not rough-hewn or expedient. Many were ornate. Many had grand facades, classical detailing, arched windows, and interior finishes that required craftsmen working at a level of specialization that small industrial cities simply did not have in abundance. Where that labor came from, where the financing originated, and how these projects were organized and completed within the timelines recorded, these are questions that the institutional histories of individual hospitals rarely address in detail. The records that survive tend to document outcomes. The process, the sourcing, the workforce, those details thin out quickly. None of this points to a single cause. It is possible that city governments were more ambitious than their populations warranted, and that private philanthropists filled financial gaps that public records don't fully capture. It is possible that construction timelines in the historical record are compressed, that buildings took longer than they appear to have taken. It is possible that skilled labor was more mobile in this period than is commonly assumed, moving between cities as large projects demanded. These are all available explanations. Researchers have used versions of all of them. But available explanations and satisfying explanations are not the same thing. And the pattern, scale beyond immediate need, systems ahead of their theoretical documentation, materials beyond local capacity, does not appear in one or two places. It appears in city after city, across a span of roughly 4 decades, on 2 continents. And when you begin to look at the specific locations where these institutions concentrated, and the specific periods in which the construction accelerated, a second layer of questions starts to form, one that has less to do with any individual building and more to do with what kind of system could have produced all of them at once. Pull back far enough, and the hospital question stops being about hospitals. It becomes a question about systems. Because the pattern identified in those mid-century American cities, scale before population, technology before theory, materials beyond local capacity, does not stay contained to one region. It appears, with remarkable consistency, across the Atlantic. It appears in industrial England. It appears in Scotland. It appears in the northeastern United States and then again, almost simultaneously, in cities along the Great Lakes that had existed for fewer than 20 years. The timing is what demands attention. Not that hospitals were built, hospitals have always been built. But that hospitals of a particular scale, a particular internal sophistication, and a particular architectural grammar appeared within the same compressed window of time across geographies that had no obvious mechanism for coordinating with one another. In England, the Royal Victoria Hospital in Netley, completed in 1863, stretched a quarter-mile in length. It was, at the time of its completion, the longest building in the British Empire. It was built to house 1,000 patients. The military population it was designed to serve, even accounting for wartime projections, would have strained to fill it during most of its operational decades. Nightingale herself criticized the building's design. She argued, correctly, by later medical consensus, that its corridor-based layout was inferior to the pavilion ward system she had been advocating. And yet the resources committed to it, the scale of its construction, the sophistication of its piped water and drainage systems, reflected a level of institutional investment that did not match the stated need. It was not a temporary facility. It was not a prefabricated wartime hospital. It was built in permanent stone, with administrative wings, a chapel, and a medical school attached. It was built as though it expected to be filled, and filled continuously, for generations. The question is not whether it was well designed. The question is what model of future demand would justify building it at all. Across the Atlantic, the pattern sharpens. Between 1850 and 1875, a cluster of large hospital complexes appeared in cities across the northeastern United States, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Baltimore, that had both the population and the institutional history to justify them, at least partially. That much follows conventional logic. But then the pattern extends west. Cincinnati, in 1861, completed a hospital complex with a stated capacity of over 500 beds. The city's total population at the time was approximately 160,000, a meaningful number, but one that, at standard historical illness rates, would generate perhaps 40 to 60 serious cases requiring institutional care on any given day. The infrastructure built to serve 40 patients did not require 500 beds. It did not require the steam-heated corridors, the internal dumbwaiter systems for food delivery, or the separate surgical theater built into the East Wing. Those systems are not the result of optimism about future population growth. They are the result of knowledge about how hospitals, at sustained high volume, actually need to operate. The same observation applies to infrastructure that ran beneath these buildings. Subterranean drainage systems in mid-century hospitals were not simple. They required gradient calculations, sealed pipe materials, and an understanding of how human waste and contaminated water needed to be separated from the building's water supply. Germ theory, the formal, scientifically accepted understanding that microorganisms cause disease, was not established in mainstream medical practice until Pasteur's work in the 1860s and Lister's antiseptic protocols in 1867. The drainage separation built into hospital basements in the 1850s did not require germ theory. But it reflected, in practical engineering terms, precisely the outcome that germ theory would later explain. Builders were solving a problem that hadn't been formally identified yet. Some researchers describe this as intuitive engineering, practical men solving practical problems without needing a theoretical framework. That explanation holds in individual cases. It is harder to sustain when the same intuitive solutions appear, already integrated, in buildings across multiple cities, built by different architects, in different countries, within the same decade. In the United Kingdom, the concentrated period of hospital construction between 1845 and 1875 saw not just new institutions but new institutional typologies. Fever hospitals, facilities specifically designed for the isolation of infectious disease, appeared in several British cities before the formal identification of the pathogens responsible for those diseases. Isolation wards require a specific belief that patients carrying certain illnesses must be separated from others to prevent transmission. That belief requires, underneath it, at least an implicit theory of contagion. And the architecture of isolation, separate entrances, separate ventilation paths, restricted internal circulation, encodes that theory in brick and mortar. These buildings were designed around a concept of contagion that medical institutions had not yet officially ratified. The buildings knew something the textbooks hadn't said yet. There is also a question of uniformity. When you examine the architectural records, the drawings, the elevation plans, the written specifications that survive for hospitals built in this period, you find a striking similarity in approach across institutions that had no documented relationship with one another. The pavilion ward system, even where it was used, follows proportions that appear consistent. The placement of nursing stations relative to ward lengths, the height of ceilings, the width of corridors relative to bed count. These are not universal constants derived from obvious logic. They are specific ratios. And specific ratios, appearing in the same combinations across multiple buildings on multiple continents, suggest a shared source, a model, a pattern, a reference document, that those buildings were all working from. No single source document has been identified. Some historians attribute this to the rapid spread of professional publications in the mid-19th century, journals, pamphlets, architectural manuals that circulated among practitioners. That explanation is reasonable. But the publication record does not always precede the buildings. In several cases, the buildings appear to precede the published articulation of the principles they embody. There is a term that has emerged in certain research communities, operating mostly outside mainstream historiography, for the broader phenomenon these hospitals might represent. It is not a term used by architects or medical historians. It appears instead in discussions about urban anomalies, about infrastructure that seems mismatched to its documented context, about buildings and systems that seem to have been inserted into a timeline rather than grown from it. The term groups these observations under a larger interpretive framework. Some researchers find that framework useful. Others find it speculative. Most professional historians have not engaged with it directly. But the term exists because the observations exist. And the observations, stripped of any interpretive layer, remain: hospitals built for populations that weren't there yet, using systems that reflected theories not yet written, appearing across geographies with a consistency that suggests coordination, or something that produced the same effect as coordination. What that something was is a question the records, by themselves, do not resolve. And the hospitals built in the decade immediately following this construction peak, smaller, less sophisticated, more clearly proportioned to their local populations, only make the earlier buildings harder to explain by comparison. There is a word that appears in certain corners of historical inquiry. It surfaces in research forums, in self-published architectural analyses, in documentary series that operate at the edge of mainstream historiography. It is applied, sometimes carefully, sometimes loosely, to the broader pattern of anomalous infrastructure that Phase 1 and Phase 2 of this kind of investigation tend to uncover. The word is Tartaria. It is worth being precise about what that word means and what it does not mean, because the two are frequently confused, even by those who use it most enthusiastically. In cartographic history, Tartaria, or Tartary, is not a controversial term. It is a documented geographical designation, used by European mapmakers from roughly the 13th century through the early 19th century, referring to a large and loosely defined region spanning Central Asia, Siberia, and portions of what is now China and Mongolia. The name appears on maps produced by some of the most respected cartographers of their era. It was used by Marco Polo. It appears in Encyclopaedia Britannica's 1771 edition, where it is described as the largest country in the world. As a geographical label, Tartaria is not a theory. It is not an interpretation. It is a historical fact of mapmaking, a name that was used, was taken seriously, and then gradually receded from common usage as more precise regional naming took over in the 19th century. That much is uncontested. The interpretive extension of that term, the use of Tartaria not as a geographical label but as an explanatory framework for anomalous infrastructure, is a different matter entirely. In certain research communities, Tartaria has come to function as a shorthand for a broader proposition, that the infrastructure anomalies documented across the 19th century, hospitals, railway stations, government buildings, water systems, may reflect the remnants or the influence of an earlier organizational layer whose full character is not captured in the standard historical record. This is not a fringe idea in the sense of being rare. It circulates widely. It has generated substantial documentary content, architectural analysis, and archival cross-referencing. But it is an interpretive idea. And the distinction between observation and interpretation is precisely where the serious questions live. The observations themselves, the scale mismatches, the pre-theoretical systems, the architectural uniformity across disconnected geographies, do not require the Tartaria framework to be real. They exist independently of any interpretive label. Researchers who have never encountered the term Tartaria have noted similar anomalies from within conventional disciplines. Architectural historians have written about the surprising sophistication of mid-century American civic buildings. Medical historians have noted the gap between theoretical development and practical implementation in 19th century hospital design. The anomalies are not invented by the Tartaria framework. The framework is a response to anomalies that were already there. What the framework proposes, and this is where interpretations diverge sharply, is that those anomalies are connected. That they are not independent instances of local ambition or individual genius, but expressions of a single organizational logic that operated across geographies simultaneously. One interpretation holds that this logic was the residue of a more sophisticated preceding civilization, one whose material culture survived into the 19th century even as its institutional memory did not. Another interpretation holds that the logic was simply the early phase of modern industrial organization, that the 19th century saw the rapid, uneven spread of new institutional knowledge, and that the apparent simultaneity is an artifact of compressed timelines rather than a shared source. A third interpretation focuses not on civilization or organization but on capital, that the anomalous infrastructure reflects concentrated private financing that moved faster than public records tracked, funding institutions at scales that local economies couldn't explain because local economies weren't paying for them. Each of these interpretations has something to recommend it. None of them is fully supported by the available record. None of them is fully excluded by it either. What the Tartaria label does, usefully, in some contexts, and misleadingly in others, is provide a single container for observations that are otherwise scattered across disciplines that rarely speak to one another. An architectural historian examining hospital wing proportions is not reading the same literature as a cartographic historian studying 18th century Central Asian maps. A medical historian studying pre-germ theory drainage systems is not in conversation with a researcher cataloging the stylistic similarities between civic buildings in Ohio and civic buildings in Lancashire. Tartaria, as a framework, connects those conversations. It proposes that the scattered observations are facets of a single phenomenon. Whether that proposal is correct is not something the observations themselves can resolve. The observations point toward a pattern. They do not explain the pattern. And the distinction between pointing and explaining is one that serious inquiry has to hold on to, carefully, even when the pattern is compelling. The hospitals remain. They are still standing, many of them, or they stood until recent decades, when some were demolished to make way for modern medical facilities whose scale, paradoxically, finally matches the ambition of what was built a century and a half earlier. The subterranean drainage systems remain, in cities where the ground hasn't been fully turned over. The ventilation shafts remain. The proportions remain. The stone remains. And the records remain, partial, uneven, occasionally contradictory, and persistently insufficient as explanations for what the buildings themselves demonstrate was possible. Mainstream historiography has a set of tools for interpreting these buildings, and those tools produce coherent accounts. Forward-thinking planners. Visionary architects. Philanthropic financing. The rapid diffusion of professional knowledge through newly expanding publication networks. These accounts are not wrong in their individual claims. They are, taken together, somewhat thin in their explanatory power. They account for the existence of sophisticated hospitals. They struggle to account for the distribution, the simultaneity, and the internal systems of the hospitals actually built. Some researchers, operating both within and outside formal academic structures, have begun to approach these buildings the way archaeologists approach ruins of uncertain origin. Not by asking what civilization produced them, which tends to generate more argument than evidence, but by asking what the buildings themselves demonstrate about the knowledge and organizational capacity of whoever built them. That is a different question. It is a more answerable question. And the answer, in the case of the hospitals, is consistent. Whoever built them understood, in practical terms, more about disease transmission, patient volume management, and long-term institutional operation than the mainstream documentary record of their era would suggest was possible. Whether that gap reflects lost knowledge, suppressed knowledge, accelerated knowledge, or simply knowledge that moved faster through informal channels than through published ones, that question remains genuinely open. The Tartaria framework offers one kind of answer. The conventional historical framework offers another. Neither closes the case. And in that unresolved space, between what the buildings demonstrate and what the records explain, the most precise thing that can be said is also the most uncomfortable. Something knew how to build these. And we are still not entirely certain what that something was.